Minnesota Territory, 1857. While his neighbors raced to throw up standard rectangular cabins before the brutal winter, one Norwegian immigrant was still carefully measuring angles in late October. They called him a fool. They called it a waste of good timber. He was building an octagon, 8 sides instead of the proven 4, with each wall 12 feet long and logs fitted with precision that took twice as long as normal construction. His neighbors shook their heads, insisting a circle would never stand up to the snow. "You'll freeze in there, mark my words," they warned. Then November arrived with a vengeance. Temperatures plummeted to 30 below zero and stayed there for weeks. The rectangular cabins leaked heat through every corner. Families burned through cord after cord of firewood just to keep from freezing. But that fool's octagon cabin, it stayed 15 degrees warmer than every other home in the settlement. While his neighbors shivered at 10 degrees inside their own cabins, the Norwegian worked comfortably at 25 degrees, burning half the wood everyone else needed. What did this immigrant carpenter understand about heat retention and surface area that seasoned American frontiersmen had completely missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time. We love reading where these documentaries reach. Lars Ericsson stepped off the wagon in what would become Clearwater County, Minnesota, in late March of 1857, carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel, his carpenter's tools, and a dog-eared copy of Orson Fowler's A Home for All. The other settlers who had arrived that spring were already breaking ground for their cabins, racing against time to get walls up before the notorious Minnesota winter arrived. But Ericsson moved deliberately, walking the available plots of land with the measured pace of a man who had survived 30 Norwegian winters and understood that haste in construction meant death when the temperature dropped. The Norwegian had learned his trade in the timber-rich valleys around Bergen, where his father and grandfather had built homes designed to withstand months of howling Arctic wind. But it was Fowler's mathematical principles that had captured his attention during the long Atlantic crossing. The idea that an octagonal structure could enclose 20% more space than a rectangle while using the same amount of wall material, and more importantly, that fewer corners meant fewer places for precious heat to escape into the brutal frontier night. While his neighbors marked out their standard 16 by 20-foot rectangles, Ericsson spent 2 full weeks surveying his chosen plot, studying how the wind moved across the prairie, where the sun tracked during different seasons, and how snow would likely drift against his walls. He sketched calculations, in the margins of Fowler's book, working out the dimensions for an octagon that would maximize interior space while minimizing the exterior surface area exposed to wind and cold. Each of the 8 walls would measure exactly 12 feet, creating a structure with 240 square feet of living space, enclosed by only 96 feet of exterior wall, 32 feet less than the rectangular cabins his neighbors were building. The mockery began almost immediately. Samuel Morrison, a barrel-chested Pennsylvania German who had already erected the frame for his cabin, made no effort to hide his amusement. "That Norski's building a church instead of a house," he announced to anyone within earshot. "8 sides and angles everywhere. He'll spend all summer just trying to figure out how to cut the logs to fit." Morrison's own cabin followed the time-tested frontier pattern. 4 walls of 8-inch oak logs, chinked with mud and moss, with a simple gable roof that could be framed in 2 days by any man who knew his way around an axe. The ridicule only intensified when Ericsson began preparing his foundation. Where the other settlers simply leveled the ground and laid their first logs directly on the earth, the Norwegian dug down 18 inches and built up a stone foundation that raised his floor above the frost line. He mixed mortar from clay and sand, creating a barrier that would prevent moisture from wicking up into his log walls. The process took him 3 full weeks, while Morrison and the others had already begun raising their walls. "He's building a fortress instead of a cabin," laughed Thomas Brennan, an Irish immigrant whose own 12 by 16 structure was already half completed. "By the time that fool finishes digging, the rest of us will be sitting by our fires." Brennan had followed the conventional wisdom of frontier construction: get the walls up fast, get the roof on, and worry about the details later. His logs were 6 inches thick, adequate for keeping out rain and providing basic wind protection, but he had made no special provisions for the kind of cold that could turn spit solid before it hit the ground. Even Martha Henderson, whose husband had died during the journey west, leaving her to build her own shelter, expressed doubts about the Norwegian's methods. That man spent more time on his foundation than most take building an entire cabin, she confided to the other women as they gathered wild berries near the creek. Come winter, we'll see if all that extra work keeps him any warmer. But Erickson continued his methodical construction, seemingly deaf to the growing chorus of skepticism. He had selected his logs with obsessive care, choosing only 12-inch diameter white oak and pine that he had personally inspected for straightness and freedom from knots. Each log was hand-hewn with his Norwegian broadaxe, creating flat surfaces that would fit together with minimal gaps. The 8 corners of his octagon required precise angle cuts, each interior corner measuring exactly 135 degrees, a mathematical precision that required him to build special jigs and templates. The most controversial aspect of his design was the double wall construction. While his neighbors built single-thickness walls and trusted their chinking to keep out the wind, Erickson created an inner wall of 6-inch logs positioned 4 inches inside the outer 12-inch wall. The space between was packed with a mixture of sawdust, clay, and chopped prairie grass, an insulation system he had learned from his grandfather, who had built similar walls to survive the harsh coastal winters of western Norway. By September, when the other cabins were completed and their owners were already splitting wood for winter, Erickson was still working on his walls. The octagonal design required 8 separate corners to be fitted with precision, and each corner demanded 3 different angle cuts that had to align perfectly with the adjoining walls. One mistake meant recutting logs that had taken hours to prepare. Morrison took to bringing visitors by Erickson's building site as a source of entertainment, pointing out the complexity of the construction with barely concealed satisfaction. "Look at all them angles," Morrison would say, gesturing at the partially completed octagon. "Man's making work for himself that don't need making. A good square cabin served folks just fine for 200 years. All them fancy corners ain't going to keep him one bit warmer, and they're sure as hell making his construction twice as hard as it needs to be." The criticism reached its peak in October, when the first snow began to fall, and Erickson was still installing his roof beams. The octagonal design required a complex hip roof with 8 surfaces that had to be precisely calculated and cut. Each rafter had to be exactly the right length and angle to meet at the central peak, creating a roof system that was both structurally sound and capable of shedding snow efficiently. While his neighbors relaxed by their completed fireplaces, the Norwegian worked by lantern light, fitting each rafter with the patience of a man who understood that his life might depend on getting every measurement exactly right. The first serious snow arrived on November 15th, 3 weeks earlier than anyone had expected. What began as gentle flakes at dawn had become a driving blizzard by afternoon, dumping 8 inches of powder across the settlement before the sun went down. Samuel Morrison stood at his single-paned window, watching the white curtain descend across the prairie, and felt satisfied with his preparation. His rectangular cabin was snug and solid, with a good stone fireplace built into the south wall and enough split oak stacked outside to last until spring. The walls were properly chinked, the roof was tight, and he had even banked earth around the foundation to keep out drafts. But as the temperatures dropped that first night, dropping from 20 degrees at sunset to 5 degrees by midnight, Morrison began to understand that this winter would be different from anything he had experienced in Pennsylvania. The wind found every gap in his chinking, creating cold drafts that seemed to cut through the cabin despite the roaring fire in his stone hearth. He fed log after log into the flames, but the heat seemed to vanish into the cold corners of the rectangular room, leaving him shivering in his wool blanket just 6 feet from the fireplace. Thomas Brennan was having similar problems in his 12-by-16 cabin. The Irish immigrant had built his structure quickly and efficiently, following the same methods his father had used back in County Cork. But Ireland's mild winters had never prepared him for the bone-deep cold of a Minnesota November. His 6-inch logs, adequate for keeping out rain and moderate cold, seemed to offer no resistance to the Arctic wind that howled across the open prairie. Frost began forming on the inside walls by the second night, creating a thin layer of ice that glittered in the firelight. Brennan burned through a quarter cord of wood in 3 days, feeding his fire constantly just to keep the interior temperature above freezing. Martha Henderson faced even greater challenges in her smaller 10 by 12 structure. Building alone after her husband's death, she had been forced to use whatever logs she could handle by herself, resulting in walls built from 8-inch pine logs with gaps that she had stuffed with moss and clay. The chinking had seemed adequate during the mild October weather, but now the wind drove through every imperfection, creating a constant circulation of cold air that made her small cabin feel like a wind tunnel. She wrapped herself in every blanket she owned and still woke each morning to find ice in her water bucket, despite keeping a fire burning all night. The temperature continued to drop throughout the week, reaching 15 below zero by November 22nd. At this point, the rectangular cabins began to fail in ways their builders had never anticipated. Morrison discovered that his corner joints, which had seemed tight during construction, had shrunk in the dry cold, opening gaps that allowed wind to whistle through the cabin. The four corners of his rectangular structure created dead zones where the heat from his fireplace could not reach, leaving pockets of near-freezing air just 10 feet from his roaring hearth. Even worse, Morrison's stone fireplace, built against the exterior wall according to conventional frontier practice, was conducting precious heat directly through the wall to the outside air. The massive stones that absorbed heat during the day radiated it through the log wall all night, creating a thermal bridge that dumped his hard-earned warmth into the Arctic darkness. He found himself burning nearly half a cord of wood per week just to maintain a barely tolerable temperature inside the cabin. Brennan's situation deteriorated even faster. His smaller cabin should have been easier to heat, but the 6-inch walls provided so little insulation that the interior temperature tracked only 10 degrees warmer than the outside air. When the thermometer dropped to 20 below, Brennan's cabin interior hovered near 0 degrees, cold enough that his breath formed visible clouds, and his water froze solid despite a constantly burning fire. He began sleeping next to the fireplace, feeding logs into the flames every 2 hours through the night. The crisis deepened when the wind shifted to come straight out of the northwest, bringing with it the kind of sustained Arctic blast that old-timers called a blue norther. For 5 days straight, the temperature never rose above 25 below zero, while the wind maintained a constant 30-mile-per-hour howl that drove the cold through every crack and gap in the settlers' hastily built walls. Morrison's consumption jumped to nearly a cord of wood per week as he desperately tried to keep his cabin habitable. Martha Henderson faced a choice between burning her furniture for fuel or abandoning her cabin entirely. Her small structure, never properly insulated, had become uninhabitable when the interior temperature dropped below zero despite her constant fire. Ice formed not just on her water bucket, but on the interior walls themselves, creating a shimmering coating of frost that never melted even with the fireplace blazing. She began spending her days at Morrison's cabin, contributing what firewood she could scrounge in exchange for a place by his hearth. By December 1st, when the thermometer registered 32 below zero for 3 consecutive nights, the settlement's conventional construction methods had reached their breaking point. Morrison was burning through his entire winter wood supply at 4 times the rate he had planned, while Brennan had already started burning fence posts and furniture to keep his fire going. The rectangular cabins that had seemed so practical and efficient during construction were proving to be thermal disasters, bleeding heat through their corners, their single-thickness walls, and their exterior-mounted fireplaces. Even the local carpenter, Jacob Miller, who had initially dismissed Ericsson's octagonal design as unnecessary complexity, was beginning to question the wisdom of traditional construction methods. His own cabin, built with the skill of a professional craftsman, was still losing the battle against the unprecedented cold. Despite 8-inch walls properly chinked with oakum and clay, despite a well-built fireplace with a proper damper, his rectangular cabin required constant feeding of fuel to maintain even basic habitability. The snow continued to accumulate, reaching 2 feet deep by the first week of December, while the temperature remained locked in a pattern of bitter cold that seemed to have no end. The settlers had planned for a normal Minnesota winter, with temperatures occasionally dropping to 10 or 15 below zero. But this sustained Arctic siege was beyond anything in their experience. Their rectangular cabins, adequate for the moderate winters they had known back east, were failing catastrophically in the face of prairie cold that seemed to have no bottom and wind that never stopped howling. While his neighbors shivered in their failing rectangular cabins, Lars Ericsson sat comfortably in his completed Octagon, reading Fowler's treatise by the steady light of an oil lamp. Outside, the thermometer registered 34 below zero, with wind gusts that rattled the windows of every other structure in the settlement. But inside the Norwegians' carefully constructed Octagon, the temperature held steady at 26 degrees above zero, a full 60-degree difference from the howling darkness beyond his walls. The secret lay in the mathematical precision of Ericsson's design. Where Morrison's rectangular cabin presented 112 linear feet of exterior wall to the brutal wind, Ericsson's Octagon exposed only 96 feet of wall surface while enclosing the same interior space. More critically, the octagonal shape eliminated the four sharp corners that created dead air zones in rectangular structures. Heat from Ericsson's centrally positioned fireplace could circulate freely throughout the single room, reaching every corner with equal efficiency. But the real innovation was invisible, hidden within the double-wall construction that had drawn so much ridicule during building season. Between Ericsson's outer 12-inch logs and inner 6-inch walls lay 4 inches of carefully packed insulation, a mixture of sawdust, prairie grass, and clay that created an almost impermeable barrier against heat loss. The sawdust, dried to perfect moisture content during the summer months, provided countless tiny air pockets that trapped warm air and prevented convection. The clay bound the mixture together, while the prairie grass added structural integrity that prevented the insulation from settling over time. Most importantly, Ericsson's fireplace sat in the center of the octagonal room rather than against an exterior wall. Where Morrison's stone hearth conducted precious heat directly through his cabin wall to the frigid outside air, the Norwegian's central fireplace radiated warmth equally in all directions, with the massive stone construction acting as a thermal battery that stored heat during the day and released it slowly through the night. The chimney, rising through the center of the octagonal roof, provided draft without creating the heat-robbing thermal bridge that plagued conventional fireplaces. The efficiency was remarkable. While Morrison burned nearly a full cord of wood each week to maintain barely tolerable conditions, Ericsson's consumption held steady at just 3/4 of a cord for the same 7-day period. The octagonal cabin's superior heat retention meant that a fire built up in the evening would keep the interior comfortable until dawn, requiring only one middle-of-the-night stoking compared to the hourly feeding that Morrison's fireplace demanded. Samuel Morrison first noticed the difference on December 3rd, when he stepped outside at dawn to split more wood and saw no smoke rising from Ericsson's chimney despite the 28 below temperature. Morrison's own fireplace had been burning continuously for 6 hours, consuming log after log just to keep his cabin's interior above freezing, yet the Norwegian's chimney showed only the faintest wisp of smoke. Either the man had frozen to death during the night, or his strange octagonal design was performing far better than anyone had imagined. Curiosity overcame pride around mid-morning, when Morrison knocked on Ericsson's door expecting to find a frozen corpse. Instead, the Norwegian answered wearing only a wool shirt and trousers, comfortable enough that he had been working at his small table without gloves or hat. The interior of the Octagon felt almost tropical compared to Morrison's icebox cabin, warm enough that Ericsson had been able to let his fire burn down to glowing coals while still maintaining a temperature that would have required Morrison's full blazing fireplace. The contrast became even more apparent when Thomas Brennan arrived that afternoon, seeking to borrow firewood after burning through his own supply 3 weeks ahead of schedule. Brennan had spent the previous night huddled next to his fireplace, feeding it fence posts and furniture legs to maintain enough heat to prevent his water from freezing solid. When he stepped into Ericsson's Octagon, the Irishman stopped mid-sentence, stunned by the comfortable warmth that seemed to envelope him from all sides. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," Brennan whispered, unwrapping the wool scarf he had kept wound around his face for the past week. "It's warm as spring in here." The Norwegian's cabin maintained such consistent temperature that frost had never formed on the interior walls, a sharp contrast to Brennan's ice palace, where he chipped frozen condensation off his walls each morning. Martha Henderson's arrival that evening completed the impromptu gathering of Ericsson's former critics. The widow had spent the day at Morrison's cabin, contributing her meager supply of kindling in exchange for a place by his fire. But even Morrison's constant blaze could not keep his rectangular cabin comfortable when the temperature dropped below 30 below. When Henderson stepped through Erickson's door, she immediately began unwrapping the layers of blankets and coats that had become her permanent armor against the cold. The most telling detail was Erickson's wood consumption. While Morrison had burned through nearly 2 cords since the cold snap began, and Brennan had already resorted to burning furniture, the Norwegian's neatly stacked woodpile showed consumption of less than 1 cord over the same period. The mathematical efficiency of the octagonal design was translating into real-world survival advantages that could mean the difference between life and death as the winter continued. Jakob Muller, the settlement's carpenter, arrived the following morning with his professional eye trained on the details of Ericsson's construction. Muller had initially dismissed the octagonal design as an unnecessary complication, but the sustained brutal cold had humbled his confidence in conventional methods. His own expertly built rectangular cabin was consuming wood at an unsustainable rate despite professional quality construction and materials. Muller spent an hour examining the octagon's corners, noting how the 135-degree angles eliminated the sharp thermal bridges that plagued rectangular construction. He studied the central fireplace placement, understanding for the first time how positioning the heat source at the room's center created efficient circulation patterns that reached every corner of the space. Most significantly, he recognized the brilliance of the double-wall insulation system that had seemed like wasteful over-engineering during construction, but was now proving to be the key to winter survival. As December deepened and the temperature remained locked below 20 below zero, the performance gap between Ericsson's Octagon and the settlement's rectangular cabins continued to widen. While his neighbors burned through their winter wood supplies at catastrophic rates, the Norwegian maintained comfortable living conditions with sustainable fuel consumption, proving that his seemingly excessive preparation had been perfectly calibrated for the reality of prairie winter. By December 10th, Samuel Morrison's wood supply had dwindled to less than 2 weeks' worth at his current consumption rate, while the thermometer showed no signs of moderating from its sustained readings below 25 degrees. The Pennsylvania German swallowed his pride and approached Ericsson's Octagon just after dawn, carrying an armload of split oak as an offering. When the Norwegian opened his door, Morrison felt the wave of warm air wash over his frost-bitten face like a benediction. "I was wondering," Morrison began, his breath forming clouds in the bitter morning air, "if you might have room by your fire for a neighbor who's running short on fuel." The words came hard to a man who had spent months mocking the octagonal design, but the alternative was watching his family freeze to death in their inadequate rectangular cabin. Erickson nodded without a trace of satisfaction or judgment. "Bring your wife and children," he said simply. "There is space." Within an hour, Morrison had moved his family's essential belongings into the Octagon, marveling at how the single room could accommodate 6 people while maintaining the comfortable warmth that had eluded his larger cabin, despite burning twice as much wood. The Norwegian's response to his neighbor's crisis revealed the depth of his preparation. The Octagon's interior had been designed not just for efficiency, but for expandability. The central fireplace could heat a much larger space than Erickson needed for himself, and the octagonal floor plan allowed for sleeping areas to be arranged around the perimeter without interfering with heat circulation. Morrison's family settled into the southwest section of the room, where body heat and reflected warmth from the central fireplace created a microclimate that remained consistently comfortable. Thomas Brennan arrived that same evening, his own cabin having become uninhabitable when the interior temperature dropped to 10 below zero despite his continuous fire. The Irishman brought what remained of his food stores and his last half-cord of wood, contributions that Erickson accepted graciously, while making space around the Octagon's perimeter. Brennan marveled at the consistent temperature throughout the room. There were no cold corners, no dead zones where heat could not reach, no spots where frost formed on interior walls. Martha Henderson followed 2 days later, when her small cabin's inadequate construction finally surrendered completely to the sustained cold. She had spent the previous night at Morrison's abandoned rectangular cabin, feeding his leftover furniture to the fireplace just to prevent her water from freezing solid. When she stepped into the octagon, Henderson wept at the sensation of genuine warmth for the first time in weeks. The widow took up residence near the east wall, contributing her skills as a seamstress and cook to the small community that was forming around Ericsson's superior shelter. The octagon's capacity seemed almost magical to settlers who had grown accustomed to the cold zones and drafts of rectangular construction. 7 adults could move freely throughout the single room without anyone being relegated to shivering in a frigid corner. The central fireplace radiated heat equally in all directions, while the octagonal walls reflected and circulated the warmth with an efficiency that rectangular corners could never achieve. Even with 7 people sharing the space, Ericsson's fuel consumption increased by only 30%, a fraction of what it would have taken to heat multiple rectangular cabins to the same comfort level. Jakob Müller, the local carpenter, made his request on December 15th, when his professionally built cabin finally succumbed to the same thermal failures that had defeated the others. Müller brought his tools and his expertise, offering to help with maintenance and repairs in exchange for shelter. More importantly, he brought his professional curiosity about the construction methods that were keeping them all alive. During the long winter evenings, with the wind howling outside and the fire crackling in the center of the warm octagon, Müller questioned Ericsson relentlessly about every aspect of the design. The Norwegian shared his knowledge freely, explaining how the octagonal shape minimized surface area while maximizing interior volume, how the double wall construction with packed insulation created a thermal barrier that rectangular cabins could never match, and how the central fireplace eliminated the heat losses that plagued conventional designs. Müller took careful notes, sketching the octagon's proportions and documenting the insulation mixture ratios. He measured the angles of the roof rafters, studied the foundation design that kept moisture away from the log walls, and examined the chimney construction that provided efficient draft without thermal bridging. The carpenter was already planning his next cabin, incorporating Ericsson's principles into a design that could be replicated by other settlers. The most remarkable aspect of the octagon's performance was its fuel efficiency with a full load of occupants. Where the abandoned rectangular cabins had consumed massive amounts of wood just to maintain barely tolerable conditions for single families, Ericsson's design kept 7 adults comfortable while burning less wood than any of the conventional cabins had used individually. The mathematical principles that Fowler had described in theoretical terms were proving themselves with life-or-death precision in the reality of Minnesota winter. As December progressed and the cold showed no signs of breaking, the octagon became more than just emergency shelter. It became a laboratory for practical winter survival. Ericsson taught his temporary housemates about heat circulation patterns, showing them how warm air rose from the central fireplace and spread evenly throughout the octagonal space before descending along the walls in a continuous circulation pattern. He explained how the double wall construction created a dead airspace that prevented conductive heat loss, and how the packed sawdust insulation trapped countless tiny air pockets that stopped convective currents. The settlers learned about thermal mass from watching how the central fireplace's stone construction stored heat during the day and radiated it slowly through the night. They observed how the octagon's lack of sharp corners eliminated the cold pockets that had made their rectangular cabins miserable, and they experienced firsthand how proper insulation could make the difference between survival and death when the temperature dropped below the limits of human endurance. By the winter solstice, when other settlements across Minnesota were reporting frozen deaths and cabin failures, Ericsson's octagon sheltered 7 adults in genuine comfort while consuming less firewood than a single conventional cabin required for basic habitability. The Norwegians' seemingly excessive preparation had become the foundation for a small community's survival, proving that innovation guided by traditional knowledge could overcome the failures of accepted practice. When the Chinook wines finally arrived in mid-March of 1858, bringing the first sustained thaw after 4 months of brutal cold, the settlement that emerged from winter looked drastically different from the one that had entered it. The rectangular cabins that had housed families just 5 months earlier stood abandoned and partially dismantled, their inadequate walls serving now only as sources of salvaged lumber. But Ericsson's octagon remained intact and functional, having sheltered 7 adults through the worst winter in Minnesota territorial history without a single case of frostbite or cold-related illness. Jakob Muller was the first to act on the hard-won lessons of survival. Even before the snow had completely melted, the carpenter began laying out the foundation for a new octagonal cabin on his original homestead plot. He had spent the long winter evenings copying Ericsson's measurements and proportions into a detailed notebook, documenting every angle cut and insulation ratio that had kept them alive. Muller's new octagon would be slightly larger than the Norwegian's original, 10 walls instead of 8, each measuring 14 feet in length, but it would incorporate all the thermal principles that had proven so effective. Muller's construction attracted immediate attention from neighboring settlers who were returning to assess the winter damage to their own properties. Word had spread throughout the broader region about the octagonal cabin that had sheltered multiple families while conventional structures failed catastrophically. Samuel Morrison, whose rectangular cabin now served only as a source of salvage lumber, became Muller's most enthusiastic assistant, helping to cut the precise angles required for the 10-sided walls. The carpenter's professional reputation ensured that his adoption of octagonal construction carried weight throughout the territory. When Muller publicly announced that he was abandoning rectangular cabin design in favor of Ericsson's methods, other builders began paying attention. The Norwegian's theoretical principles proven through a winter that had killed settlers in conventional cabins across 3 counties suddenly became practical wisdom that could be measured in cords of wood saved and lives preserved. Thomas Brennan used his small savings to hire Muller for construction of his own octagonal replacement cabin, specifying the same double-wall insulation system that had kept the Norwegian shelter comfortable throughout the sustained cold. Brennan had calculated that even with the higher construction costs, the Octagon's fuel efficiency would pay for itself within 2 winters through reduced wood consumption. More importantly, he had experienced firsthand the difference between surviving winter and living comfortably through it. Martha Henderson faced a more complex challenge as a widow building alone, but Muller adapted Ericsson's design principles to create a smaller hexagonal cabin that she could construct with hired help during the summer. Months. The 6-sided design maintained the crucial advantage of eliminating sharp corners while reducing the complexity of angle cuts that had made the octagon so challenging to build. Henderson's hexagon used the same double-wall insulation and central fireplace design, scaled down to accommodate a single resident while maintaining thermal efficiency. By the summer of 1858, 3 octagonal cabins and 2 hexagonal structures were under construction within 5 miles of Ericsson's original design. Each builder incorporated lessons learned during the shared winter experience, refining details while maintaining the core principles that had proven so effective. The central fireplace design became standard, as did the double-wall construction with packed sawdust insulation and the raised stone foundation that prevented moisture infiltration. The mathematical efficiency of octagonal construction gained credibility beyond the immediate settlement when territorial surveyors began documenting the winter's casualties. Conventional rectangular cabins had failed at a rate of nearly 40% across the affected region, with families forced to abandon their homes or suffer serious cold-related injuries. But the 3 octagonal structures that had existed before the winter, Ericsson's cabin plus 2 others built by Norwegian immigrants in adjacent counties, had maintained habitability throughout the crisis without a single structural failure or thermal breakdown. Word of the octagonal success reached St. Paul by late summer, where territorial officials were investigating construction methods that could improve settler survival rates. Orson Fowler's theoretical writings on octagonal architecture, previously dismissed as impractical experimentation, suddenly gained serious attention from government officials responsible for encouraging Western settlement. The practical proof provided by Ericsson's winter performance gave credibility to principles that had existed only on paper. Muller began receiving requests for octagonal construction from settlers as far away as the Dakota Territory, where word had spread about the Minnesota cabins that had outperformed conventional structures during extreme weather. The carpenter established a traveling construction business, spending summers helping families build octagonal and hexagonal cabins using the methods he had learned from Ericsson. Each project refined the techniques further, creating regional variations adapted to local materials and climate conditions. The Norwegian himself remained characteristically modest about his role in revolutionizing frontier construction methods. Erickson continued living in his original Octagon, which had become something of a pilgrimage site for builders seeking to understand the practical application of thermal efficiency principles. He welcomed visitors generously, sharing his knowledge freely and helping other settlers adapt octagonal designs to their specific needs and circumstances. By 1860, octagonal construction had become common enough in the Minnesota Territory that local sawmills began pre-cutting the angled lumber required for eight-sided walls. The technique had proven particularly valuable in regions where fuel wood was scarce or expensive, as the superior insulation properties of double-wall octagonal construction could reduce winter heating requirements by 40 to 50% compared to conventional rectangular cabins. The transformation extended beyond individual buildings to influence territorial policy on frontier settlement. Government officials began recommending octagonal construction methods in official publications designed to help Eastern settlers prepare for Western conditions. Fowler's mathematical principles, validated by Erickson's practical demonstration, became part of the standard advice given to families planning to homestead in regions with harsh winter climates. The legacy of that brutal winter of 1857 became a touchstone for practical innovation on the American frontier. Erickson's quiet determination to build according to proven principles rather than accepted convention had not only saved his own life, but had created a template for survival that would protect thousands of families in the decades that followed. The octagonal cabin, once ridiculed as an impractical waste of time and materials, had proven that sometimes the most unconventional approach is the most fundamentally sound.